The movie begins with Charlie, a high school student, searching for holiday jobs on his school's bulletin board. He notices an advertisement for a job as a house sitter for an elderly man and takes the ad with him. As Charlie leaves the school, some classmates make fun of him, inviting him on a trip despite knowing he's on student aid and can't afford trips. One of the boys, George, reprimands them for doing it despite knowing his condition. Charlie arrives at the house, where a woman named Rosie guides him to a smaller house in the backyard. She explains that he'll be looking after Uncle Frank, who comes across as a grumpy old man but is actually kind. Charlie introduces himself to Frank, who insists on not being called sir. Frank inquires what Charlie's parents do for a living, and Charlie shares that his stepfather and mother run a convenience store from early morning till late at night. Frank praises their hard work and questions why Charlie is so far from home attending Baird School. Frank questions how Charlie managed to afford it even with the student aid, and Charlie explains he's attending on a scholarship. Suddenly, Rossie's daughter appears at Frank's window, and Frank tosses a cushion at the window to shoo her away, expressing frustration at the lack of manners in his own family. Frank then curiously asks about Charlie's skin, specifically about any pimples. Charlie explains his skin history, but Frank interrupts, uninterested in the details. Frank continues to mock Charlie, suggesting that all Baird students are trying to become like George Bush. Charlie corrects him, noting that Bush went to Andover, which irritates Frank and leads to him scolding Charlie aggressively. Frank questions Charlie's intentions, and Charlie explains that he just wants to earn money for a plane ticket to return home for Christmas. After Frank dismisses him, Charlie goes to Rosie to express his concern that Frank won't hire him. Rosie reassures Charlie that he's the only applicant, so he must take the job. She explains that Frank's outer appearance isn't the real him, and also he sleeps a lot, which will allow Charlie to have some freedom. Rosie shares that she feels better knowing someone is looking after Frank because he's stubborn and independent but also blind and in need of care. While working a shift at the school library, Charlie assists George in checking out a book. After closing the library, they witness Harry and George's friends placing a bag on a street light. Suddenly, Mrs. Hunsaker shows up, and they divert her attention, allowing the other boys to escape. The following morning, the headmaster parks his car under the same streetlight, and the boys recite a humorous poem about him doing favors for trustees, resulting in them gifting him a Jaguar. The bag on the streetlight is filled with gas, creating a balloon effect. When the headmaster pops the balloon, white paint splatters all over him and his car. Charlie and George are summoned to identify the culprits, but choose not to reveal their identities. The headmaster informs them that a disciplinary committee will address the situation on Monday. Charlie and George will be expelled unless the responsible students are identified by then. The headmaster informs George to leave and speaks to Charlie alone. The headmaster tries to bribe Charlie by revealing that he annually recommends an exceptional underprivileged student for Harvard, and this year, he could choose Charlie. Despite the offer, Charlie remains steadfast in not revealing the culprits. Meeting Charlie outside, George emphasizes the sense of unity at Baird, explaining that nobody would betray their teammates by snitching. Charlie visits Frank's house, and Rosie provides him with instructions. Charlie heads to Frank, who instructs him to pack his clothes. Frank mentions that Rosie has already said goodbye multiple times, jokingly suggesting she has separation anxiety. Rosie reappears to say her final goodbye. While Charlie is packing, he accidentally touches Frank, and Frank reprimands him for it. Frank inquires about the arrival of the taxi, leaving Charlie needing clarification. Charlie asks where they're going, and Frank reveals they're headed to New York, cautioning Charlie not to inform Rosie. Frank bids farewell to his cat and departs for the airport. At the airport, he surprises Charlie by revealing he's also secured a ticket for him. However, when Charlie tries to guide Frank through the crowd by holding his arm, Frank scolds him, insisting that if Charlie can see, he should walk independently. Instead, Frank takes Charlie's arm for guidance. During the flight in first class, Charlie informs Frank that he plans to return home right after dropping Frank off. Frank agrees, stating Charlie is free to do as he pleases. The flight attendant serves them drinks, prompting Frank to express admiration for women and gratitude to God for creating them. Upon arriving at the hotel, Frank contacts the reception to announce his return as Frank Slade, a former regular. He arranges a dinner reservation for 8:15 and calls another person to arrange a limousine at 8 o'clock. Charlie expresses his need to return due to unfinished school matters. but Frank proposes a compromise. They'll have dinner together. Then Frank will ensure Charlie gets to the airport to catch his flight home. He suggests that Charlie unpack while they're at the hotel. They settle into the car, and Frank questions the driver about arranging escorts. He then turns to Charlie and asks what's troubling him at school, and Charlie admits to being torn between telling or not telling something. As the driver announces their arrival at the Oak Room, they reach their dinner table. Charlie reads the menu to Frank, expressing surprise at Frank's ability to afford such luxury. Frank reveals that he saved his disability checks for this special occasion. Charlie inquires about Frank's plan, but Frank refuses to disclose it. When Charlie persists in wanting to leave, Frank explains that he requires Charlie's assistance to carry out his plan, prompting Charlie to inquire again. Frank reveals his plan: to travel first class, enjoy lavish places, dine expensively, have intimate relations with a woman, and ultimately end his life by shooting himself. Charlie is utterly stunned, but Frank doesn't really care. The following morning, Charlie awakens to find a stylist named Sophia grooming Frank. Frank informs Charlie that he also has clothes for him and encourages him to get up. Charlie calls George, who advises him to act like he heard or saw nothing. Overhearing this conversation, Frank chimes in, noting that Charlie lacks the advantage of a wealthy father like George's. Frank emphasizes that to survive, Charlie may need to cooperate with authorities. He imparts a life lesson, mentioning two types of people: those who face challenges head-on and those who seek refuge. He advises Charlie to remember that seeking cover is often the wiser choice. After dressing up, Frank and Charlie head to Frank's brother's house. Randy, Frank's nephew, answers the door and seems uncomfortable with Frank's presence. Frank calls his brother downstairs, who also doesn't appear thrilled to see him. Frank's brother tells Charlie that he should have taken Frank to his home for Thanksgiving. The family gathers around the dinner table, and Frank starts sharing stories from his military days that only Charlie seems interested in. Randy becomes increasingly agitated, accusing Frank of deliberately trying to shock people. Frank asks Charlie for the time, prompting Randy to suggest that Frank should wear a Braille watch to avoid inconveniencing others with his dependency. Randy's wife, Gail, tries to defuse the tension, but Frank comments about Gail's dissatisfaction and challenges him to be a better husband. This infuriates Randy further, and he insults Frank by telling him to return to his other alcoholic friends. Charlie attempts to calm Randy, but Randy addresses him as Chucky, which annoys Frank. Frank corrects Randy, and when Randy continues to tell Charlie that Frank poses as a war hero, but one time he was so excited and drunk that he ended up blowing a grenade and lost his eyesight. Randy belittles Charlie by calling him Chucky again, and Frank loses his temper. He grabs Randy by the collar and starts choking him. Charlie rushes to the other side, asking Frank to release Randy, and saying he doesn't care about Randy's insults. Frank finally lets go, bids farewell to his brother, and leaves with Charlie. The next morning, Charlie is awakened by a noise and hurries to Frank's room, where he finds Frank preparing his gun. Panicking, Charlie tries to call Rossi, but Frank eats the piece of paper with her contact information. Charlie proposes staying another day with Frank if he hands over the bullets, and Frank agrees. Frank questions why Charlie won't let him die, and Charlie says he has a conscience. Frank instructs him to mature, as the conscience doesn't govern the world. Charlie takes Frank to a salon, and during their return, Charlie admits he was offered a bribe. The headmaster would help him secure admission to Harvard if he cooperates. Frank advises him to accept the offer. While buying Charlie a beer, they spot a woman sitting alone. Charlie describes her beauty, and Frank guides them to her table. Frank asks if they can wait with her for the person she's expecting, and she agrees. Frank reveals his ability to identify fragrances and accurately names the perfume she's wearing, surprising her. She introduces herself as Donna, and Frank then asks if she'd like to learn tango, but she declines, explaining that the man she's waiting for, Michael, dislikes it. Frank insists he can teach her, and they dance a tango together. When Michael arrives, he informs Donna of an urgent matter they need to attend to, and they depart. They arrive at a hotel, and Charlie remains in the car while Frank heads to the woman waiting for him in a room. Charlie contacts George, who informs him that he's considering getting his father involved to resolve their issue with the headmaster. The next morning, Charlie shares this with Frank, who dismisses the idea, emphasizing that individual action is required in such situations, and George's father will only save George. Frank appears unwell and bedridden, causing Charlie to worry. Frank urges Charlie to use his plane ticket, take pay for the job from Frank's wallet, and leave. He holds Charlie's hand and encourages him to go. Charlie attempts to lift Frank's spirits by suggesting they go out, emphasizing the pleasant weather. After some convincing, they decide to go for a ride. They rent a Ferrari and set off, although Frank seems distant and detached. Charlie allows Frank to drive on an empty road, guiding him. However, Frank becomes erratic, speeding and driving recklessly, resulting in being pulled over by the police. Through clever maneuvering, they escape without a ticket, with Frank pretending not to be blind. With Charlie taking the wheel, they switch seats, but Frank's condition deteriorates. He appears to lose control of his body, staggering. After returning to the rented car, they walk back. At a traffic light, they wait for it to turn red so they can cross the road. However, Frank's impatience overtakes him, and he starts moving into the busy traffic. Charlie follows, but Frank continues until he collapses on the other side. Charlie reaches him and offers his cane, but Frank only clings to Charlie's arm, requesting to be taken back to the hotel. Back at the hotel, Charlie contacts George, but George's butler informs him that George isn't allowed to speak to anyone from the school. Frank instructs Charlie to fetch him an aspirin for his pounding headache. He also asks Charlie to go to a specific shop and request cigars from the owner, who knows Frank and will provide the right ones. Charlie heads to the lobby but senses something urges him to hurry back to the room, and he finds Frank dressed in his military uniform, preparing his gun. Frank orders Charlie to leave, but Charlie urges him to give up the gun, reminding him that he handed over the bullets. However, Frank admits he lied about giving all the bullets to Charlie. Frank raises the gun, pointing it at Charlie, stating that his life is already ruined, as George will pin all the blame on him. Charlie pleads to put down the gun, and Frank opens up. He explains that he has accepted mistreatment throughout his life, thinking it gave him a sense of importance. In contrast, Charlie is caring and pure-hearted, making Frank realize his flaws. Charlie insists Frank isn't entirely bad. He's just in pain. Frank remains defensive, loading the gun and insisting Charlie knows nothing of pain. Charlie attempts to grab the gun, but Frank threatens to end his life by shooting him. Just as Frank presses the gun to his head, Charlie makes a final effort to snatch it away but fails. Frank threatens to shoot Charlie this time, and Charlie doesn't stop him but instead encourages him to pull the trigger. Frank hesitates, but Charlie continues to insist. Frank resists, asserting that Charlie wants to live, and thus he can't shoot him. Charlie counters, expressing that he sees value in Frank's life, citing his skillful driving of the Ferrari and dancing the tango. Charlie pleads through tears, urging Frank to lower the gun. Eventually, Frank complies, asking Charlie to fetch him a drink. As they sit together, Frank sips his drink and confides in Charlie. He shares that he continued living all these years because he dreamed of finding a woman who would be there for him. However, he confesses that he's now accepted his fate and abandoned that dream. They take a taxi to the airport, and Frank asks Charlie for an update. Charlie admits that Frank was right about George, and Frank inquires about Charlie's father. Charlie reveals that his father left when he was young, and he didn't have a close relationship with his stepfather. Frank hands him $300 for the job, and they say their goodbyes, shaking hands. Before leaving, Frank touches Charlie's features with his face in a farewell gesture. The disciplinary meeting commences, and to everyone's surprise, Frank appears, dressed elegantly. He sits beside Charlie and introduces himself as a close friend of Charlie's parents, attending on their behalf. The headmaster questions George, who eventually provides the names of his friends while expressing uncertainty. Then the headmaster turns to Charlie, urging him to recount what he witnessed. Despite the pressure, Charlie refuses to snitch. The headmaster announces that George will be pardoned for speaking up, but Charlie will be expelled. In a dramatic turn of events, Frank stands up and delivers a powerful speech. He accuses the school of unjustly using Charlie as a scapegoat, highlighting Charlie's extraordinary leadership qualities and potential. Frank contends that Charlie's lack of financial privilege is being exploited to compromise his future by emphasizing that Charlie deserves better and that his unique qualities should be nurtured. Through his words, Frank aims to inspire them to reconsider their decision and recognize Charlie's innocence, ultimately influencing the committee's change of heart. The committee decides not to punish Charlie. The news makes the entire school rejoice in Charlie's support. Exiting the meeting, they encounter the head of the disciplinary committee. Quick on his feet, Frank identifies the perfume she's wearing, impressing her. Later, Charlie accompanies Frank to Rossi's house, where he observes Frank's increased openness and comfort with the idea of living.